Good afternoon and welcome to all world traders, their guests and members of the financial services group of livery companies. It's lovely to see so many of you here. Before we start, could I just ask you to keep your microphones on mute unless called upon to ask a question? And please do feel free to put your questions in the chat function at any time. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who is Sir Paul Collier, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford, and a Director of International Growth Centre and of the Economic and Social Research Council. Sir Paul will be well known to many of you as the author of several books, and I think their titles speak for themselves, including The Plundered Planet, How to Reconcile Prosperity with Nature, The Bottom Billion, Why the Poorest Countries Are Failing and What Can Be Done About It, The Future of Capitalism, and most recently, Greed is Dead. I love that title. Published with a fellow economist, John Kay, and that came out in July this year. So Paul's research covers the transformation from poverty to prosperity, migration and refugees, urbanization in poor countries, the causes and consequences of civil war, private investment in Africa infrastructure, and much, much more. He received a knighthood in 2014 for promoting research and policy change in Africa, and has been listed as one of the 100 most influential public thinkers. Who better then to address us on the subject of opening Africa to business while closing it to crooks? Sir Paul, a very warm welcome.
Thanks very much. Thank you. This is a lunch meeting where none of us are getting lunch, but I'll try and sing for the supper I'm not getting. So what I'm going to do is, if it goes to plan, is I'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then that will leave us about 40 minutes for questions and comments and discussion. You know much more about your work and business than I can possibly know. So the challenge is to try and say something that I know about that's of interest or use to you, and I'll do my best. And I want to start with the sort of big picture obvious things. Here's Africa, this huge continent, over 1 billion people, and ridiculously poor. Ridiculously poor. Why is it poor? Because people are ridiculously unproductive. Ridiculous because we now know how to make people productive. And so it's hard when you're at the level of, say, Singapore or America to raise productivity much further. We're doing it, but it's a struggle because it's a journey into the unknown all the time. But to raise productivity from virtually nothing to sort of middle income levels, we know how that's done. It's not rocket science. And so there's a huge potential for doing that in places where it hasn't yet happened. And Africa basically fits that bill. In that process of transformation from pitifully low productivity to modest prosperity, in that transformation, there's a need for a lot of investment, a lot of capital, and just at the moment, world capital markets are completely awash with capital, trying to find a home. And of course, there's such an imbalance between people wanting to save and people wanting to invest that the market clearing rate of interest at the moment in real terms is heavily negative. and even in nominal terms, by the time you get to Germany, it's negative. So there's a huge matching opportunity between the need for investment that raises people's productivity from nearly nothing to something respectable, and this tidal wave of savings looking for a home. So that's the sort of existential opportunity that's so dramatic at the moment because of this negative real interest rates, which everybody forecasts, all the central banks forecast, will go on at least for the next decade. So expect negative real interest rates for risk-free investment that are going to persist for at least a decade. So let's turn now to Africa and look at what are the likely opportunities there. And if we look at countries, the big impediments to any sort of private business in Africa have been hostile environments for business, partly created by governments and partly just there in the underlying natures of the societies. And if we go back 50 years, that was true in a lot of Asia as well. And what happened to change Asia, especially East Asia, was we know exactly what happened. 4 little places got ahead. South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan. And partly driven by necessity, their governments set about building an environment that was less hostile to private business opportunities. And so those 4 countries started to grow. And because their productivity was initially completely pitifully low, South Korea started from per capita incomes of about $350 a year. There were so many opportunities to grow from that to more obviously feasible levels of productivity that these countries sustained rapid growth for 2-3 decades. And that made such a dramatic difference, they became standards. So famously, Singapore, which in 1961 had been desperately poor, bitterly divided, and deeply corrupt, by 1980, it was already so successful that who went to look at it but Deng Xiaoping? And he was astonished at what he saw, and he thought, well, I wonder if we could do that in China. Hence Shanghai, hence the ignition of transformation in China. And then as China started to develop, that spread around a lot of the rest of East Asia, with the most recent sort of belated change happening in Myanmar. And most dramatically, India started to get worried at the rise of China. And so with a lag of about a decade, India started to change. So that's the process which changed East Asia. It's just starting to happen in Africa, is why I tell that story. And I'm going to get practical and pick four countries where I think the governments are pretty focused on economic growth and pretty focused on now trying to improve the business environment and want private business in. You probably all have your own ideas of which are the most promising environments in Africa, but let me just give you mine in no particular order. So there's Rwanda, which is an amazing turnaround. 25 years ago, it was about the most catastrophic society on earth, just emerging from genocide, with enemies all around. It was a complete nightmare. But probably because they had no choice, they were overpopulated, no natural resources worth speaking of. They really had to concentrate their minds. And the Kagame government faced an internal struggle between those in the party which said, now we've got power, it's our turn to eat, that famous African phrase, and other people, including Kagame, who said, if we do that, we may be all right, but our children will all get slaughtered again, as happened previously. And so Kagame managed to win that struggle within the party, and that was the turning point. That was the turning point. And so for 20 years, they've been pushing on the same path. Is it perfect? No. Is it a dramatic success and dramatic improvement? Yes. So Rwanda. Ethiopia. Similar sort of story. Ethiopia emerged in the early 1990s from total catastrophe, prolonged civil war, ethnic meltdown, and it got a good leader, Meles, who set about rebuilding the society. He was quite a cautious guy, I mean, Meles, and he said, well, we're not even going to look for natural resources yet, because if we find them, we've seen what natural resources can do, stressing governance, because people start fighting over the natural resource. So we're not even going to look for natural resources. We'll leave whatever we got, we'll leave it in the ground. And they stuck to that for over 20 years. So that was a very cautious strategy. Meanwhile, they put in a huge effort to get the basic infrastructure that the private sector needs. And so despite being very low income, they managed a 37% of GDP investment rate, right up there with East Asia. To give you a contrast, Malawi, equally poor, has an investment rate of 13%. So Ethiopia managed an extra 24% on its investment rate. It was all state-run, the investment rates, so it wasn't very well managed, which the new Prime Minister, Abiy, is entirely willing to admit. But they've ended up with abundant, cheap electricity and with good physical connectivity, a rail line to the coast, and quite a good connectivity within the capital city, and a good airport. And so they're starting to develop industrial clusters, both around the airport and along that line of rail to the coast. So Ethiopia doing pretty well. And now what they realize is the return on all that infrastructure entirely depends on whether they can get the private sector in. And you can't get the private sector in by the same top-down control freedom with which they built the infrastructure. And so Ethiopia is seeing this change of tone, a change of attitude to the private sector. Then if we go to the west of Africa, Ghana. Ghana had big opportunities with oil discoveries, the Jubilee field, and to be honest, the previous government rather blew those opportunities. they borrowed heavily and used the borrowed money to increase public sector wages by 50%. Just the sort of things that you shouldn't do. But the government that replaced it is actually a very good government, I think, and very focused on trying to build private sector. Unfortunately, it's discovered more oil, and so it's not staggeringly indebted, which was what the danger would have been had it not discovered. The new oil basically annuls those fears of over-indebtedness. And so Ghana is a very big opportunity, very competent president, finance minister, vice president, all focused on the same agenda of getting the private sector going. And then finally Senegal, which is also recently discovered oil, also very focused on building the economic infrastructure that makes the private sector viable and then bring it in. A very, very good president, Macky Sall, who really is focused on the economy and bringing opportunities. So those are the four countries I would say have got big opportunities. There are a few others. We've got Côte d'Ivoire, which has done very well. It's just got an election coming up. Let's hope they get through it all right. But let me turn from those four countries to what you need to know to do good deals, both in those four countries and in other countries as opportunities open up, which they undoubtedly will. And what you need to know is who are the reliable local partners. And I want to suggest that that's currently something of a missing public good. If you don't know who reliable local partners are, going in can be pretty scary. Because these places very obviously abound in crooks. A lot of Africa is rather opportunistic societies because people have lived on the edge of chaos, and living on the edge of chaos, you don't build long, trusting relationships. You snatch opportunities when they present themselves. And so there are culturally, a lot of these societies are rather opportunistic. And before I mentioned, they're trying to live that down. But that was the nature of coming out of chaotic, very slow-growing societies. You snatch opportunities when they present themselves rather than plan long-term for the future. The future is just too chaotic to be planned. And so you need to know who are the reliable partners, who are not. You will all have learned from experience individually, but the public agencies which know best about this are the development finance institutions. And Britain has a pretty good one called CDC, it's the old Commonwealth Development Corporation, which has been revived and scaled up and now has a big increase in its capital base, and so is very active in Africa. So CDC is doing business in these countries with local partners and knows which ones it's found to be trustworthy. The same is true in the World Bank Group with IFC. So IFC knows which local partners it's learned to trust. Overall, around the world, there are about 40 development finance institutions. Also based in London is EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which has extended from Europe to North Africa and the Middle East, and is now poised to extend to sub-Saharan Africa. And EPRD is a very good institution. Basically, every major Western government has a development finance institution, and they all individually know which business partners locally they've learned to trust. But at the moment, they have never pooled that information together. And so there's a big opportunity, I think, for a pooling of that database, make it a public good, trusted local partners. And that should be a public good, a freely available good. And it would lower the risks of going in. There is at the moment an opportunity to create that database because Britain's G7 is coming up. And so Britain's G7 Britain has the opportunity to propose to the other G7 members that this sort of common public good could be created. I'll be suggesting that to the British government. It would help enormously if there were some voices from the private sector saying, if you built that, we'd use it, it'd be useful. So I just mentioned that as a missing public good. An earlier Zoom today was with the chief economist of IFC, and he is very keen to build that public good. But it needs the authority of the G7 governments. The G7 governments, between them, control the board of the World Bank Group. They will control each of them what their own development finance institutions do. So this is entirely within the power of 7 government leaders who will be meeting in Britain this summer. The final thing we need that is missing and will be useful to know is what sectors you should be looking at. Where are the deals most likely to be promising? And I've listed the countries. The sectors I'm not going to list because they depend on what each government thinks would be a sensible priority and what the development finance institutions think will be a sensible priority. And what at the moment is missing here is a proper dialogue between the development finance institutions like CDC, the part of the British government which is having regular discussions with governments in Africa, which is the newly merged Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So, for example, our High Commissioners our High Commissioner in Ghana, our Ambassador in Ethiopia, they should be coordinating with CDC a conversation with the government on what sectors it thinks it should be promoting. And where there's a sensible sector that a sensible government is promoting, that's where you should be looking for really scaling up the opportunities. And that comes through dialogue between CDC and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, dialogue between our ambassadors and high commissioners and governments in Africa as to the nature of dialogue. And just to close, the dialogue builds, first of all, it identifies common purposes. What should we all be coordinating around? A particular sector in a particular country. And then, for example, Rwanda very much targeted conference business over the last few years. And it built that conference business hugely successfully. So much so that I was in Rwanda in February, just before everything closed down with COVID, and the government was proud to tell me that they were now the second most visited country in the whole of Africa. Extraordinary achievement for a little country, no coast, and yet it's the second most visited country in the whole of Africa. Huge achievement, and coordinated, linked with that was public investment in a conference center, private investments in hotels, public investment in an airline, and so on. So that was a good example of an interface between private investments and public investments around a sector which thrived. And of course, for the moment, that's been completely closed down by COVID. It'll come back. It'll come back. So that's an example of what dialogue builds around common purpose, and from common purpose, a common strategy, and finally, common obligations. And it's that move from common purpose to common obligations, which is the mark of a healthy society. In case you've not read it, this is what Greed is Dead is all about, that passage of how dialogue can build common purpose, common strategy, and from that, common obligations. We're hardwired as human beings to be morally load-bearing, to be able to build mutual obligations. That's the distinctive feature of humans. We're a very unusual sort of mammal. Whereas the one sort of mammal that really can build mutual obligations. And doing that is the mark of a healthy society. So that's me done. I've gone a few minutes later than I'd expected. So let me pass back to you for comments, questions, public derision. It's all fine by me. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. There's a lot of food for thought there, Sir Paul, and there are quite a few questions coming up. I'm going to call people to ask their question. Sir Paul's agreed to take several questions at a time. So first of all, I'm going to ask Peter Cousins if you could unmute and ask your question. And then after Peter, I'm going to ask Zoe Buckingham. So Peter, your question, please.
Oh, thank you, Sir Paul. I accept what you were saying, that there's a large amount of savings of Western capital in the West looking for a new home in the current situation. I wonder to what extent the global, so-called global funds, which are available to the retail investor, invest in Africa, or whether they should, or whether that kind of investment is, whether investing in Africa is still best left to governments and other large institutions at the present time.
Thank you. Zoe, would you like to ask your question now? Zoe Buckingham.
Hello. Thank you so much, Sir Paul, for such an interesting talk. I was very interested in how Africa is proceeding with technology, and whether there are some countries that are more advanced than others in trying to use technology to move their countries forward in terms of efficiency, productivity, and a contribution to their growth.
Yeah, great.
Thank you very much. We'll just deal with those two to start with.
That's fine. So, thank you. So, Peter, yes, global funds. There's a big opportunity here, and they're just starting to open up. So, in fact, IFC is just about to release data. They've done a survey of the global funds that actually invest in Africa, and they're finding that they've been really pretty successful and have enormous impact. So that they combine a lot of interest for impact investment with big opportunities to generate jobs. I should have said that what is missing in Africa most of all is firms. And firms, no matter what sector they're in, proper firms do almost in their sleep without realizing it. They bring people together, a workforce together, so there are economies of scale, and they get people to specialize, and so there are economies of specialization. In Africa, 2/3 of Africa's human capital is working solo or in tiny micro enterprises. No scale, no specialization, doomed to low productivity. So firms are the vital ingredient that Africa needs. And the global funds are starting to put their toe in the water and discovering that actually, once the selection process is properly done, which the better development finance institutions are able to do, the risks are really quite modest, especially once you take a portfolio approach and spread your risk around. I can't predict which of those 4 countries I listed will be the most successful, but if you spread your investment around those 4, and they continue to grow at 10% as they have done in the past, even the wrong choices are going to be easily forgiven, because all boats will be rising. So yes, there's a huge opportunity for the investment funds, and the American pension funds are just starting to invest, so that it's the first edge of what I think will be a kind of big wave over the next decade. If I turn to the question about technology, yes, so there's big differences amongst countries. If we look at the private sector's capacity within a country, then I think front of the pack is Kenya. Google sent a team to Kenya, not to teach them how to do things, but to learn from them, right? Because the Kenyan young people are massively innovative on applying technology to opportunities. Rwanda is also very, very keen on new technologies. So there's very good e-connectivity and that sort of thing. Ghana is now really learning from Rwanda very consciously. So to give one example, Rwanda pioneered using drones to deliver blood supplies to rural areas, and that worked very well, very cost effective. And so the Vice President of Ghana was proudly telling me, we're now delivering more blood by drone than Rwanda. So there's that copying effect going on with the application of technology. Ghana's introduced digital postal addresses for everywhere in the country. And so everywhere, everybody can now have a digital postal identity, which is very, very, very big step forward. So there are huge, those 3 is the ones I've sort of singled out, I think.
Thank you very much. Now we've got 3 questions from David McNair, so I'll let you ask those, David, together. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Sir Paul. I had 3 questions. You've already touched on the first one, but it's a question about whether African countries face a risk premium on capital markets, and if there's anything that can be done about that from a regulatory perspective. The second is around debt sustainability and whether that's specific challenge that investors need to consider, and what can be done about that? And then the third, I mean, you talked about this DFI database. I think it's maybe called the GEMS database. And it's great that you're pushing that at the G7. Do you know anything about the constraints or the blockers to publishing that and creating a more comprehensive database? Thank you.
Yeah. Right. So the risk premium on capital markets, to what extent is it due to regulation? I think there is something in that. The regulation tends to be rather behind the curve, and so I mean, as it is even within Britain, if we look at it. So I think there's a good case for reviewing that. You cannot underestimate how public policies are not coherently coordinated. So the left hand of a regulator doesn't understand the purpose of the right hand, which is trying to increase investment opportunities, business opportunities. So just joining those things up this is why creating a sort of organized lobby, as we've got with your livery associations, is very useful. You can just put these representations and say, this is what we need. This is the regulations are in the way of something that will be mutually beneficial. As to I'll leap ahead to the question of blockages and come back to debt sustainability. What are the blockers? I wonder. London has been at the heart of quite a lot of crookedness, as well as we've not got a clean record, during the last G8 2013, I was brought in because David Cameron read my books. I'm completely apolitical, but he was very keen on my books, and so he wanted me to get involved. And I had to explain to him the scams on beneficial ownership and such like, and he was horrified. He was horrified. So he said, very straight, we need proper businesses with proper rules, and so we need to clean that up. And that was the start of the move to flushing out beneficial ownership. Some London lawyers had been really complicit in concealing beneficial ownership. David Cameron, to his enormous credit, convened the first ever meeting of all the heads of overseas territories, 18 of them. And I saw him just as he was going into the lunch. He said, this is going to be a difficult lunch. Because he basically told those 18 overseas territories that they would have to clean up their act on beneficial ownership. They couldn't have all this concealment, banking secrecy. And there's been a lot of movement forward since. The latest battlefront is going to be on beneficial ownership of property in London. And my word, that's going to flush out a hit list of the world's big crooks, right? And that will be very valuable information. So we need not only a list of who can be trusted, which is the public good, we also need a proper hit list of who can't be. And that will come from the revelations from beneficial ownership of property. So we need better behavior from the lawyers and bankers, much more know your client, much more honesty about whistleblowing. But that, at the moment, I think this is a very winnable fight in the G7. I really do. What we discovered when Cameron moved into this beneficial ownership stuff was that actually nobody was willing to stand up and say, of course we need to keep beneficial ownership secret. Of course crooks need to be protected. Right? That's what they've been doing, but nobody was willing to stand up and say, what I'm doing needs to continue. Right? So it's a winnable fight. Some fights are pretty hopeless, but that one turned out to be very winnable. Debt sustainability. We need beware. You know, some African governments are over indebted, and you know, it's just like Warren Buffett's comment about, you know, you only see you naked in the tide. Well, the tide's going out. My God, right? And so you will see that some governments have got themselves into unsustainable debt. Some have got themselves into, it depends what they use the debt for. The governments that used it just to try and win an election by paying high wages, they're going to be in big trouble. Right? The governments that used their debt to buy infrastructure, to invest in infrastructure, they've got the infrastructure. And then the question is not really, is it fundamentally this debt is unsustainable, but is the profile of debt service commensurate with the profile of returns from the infrastructure? And sometimes it isn't. But then that's the core business of especially the IMF in going to creditors and saying, do you want default or do you want a sensible profile of repayment? That's what we will see. And of course, the governments which have got unsustainable debt because they paid, they double civil service wages or something, they will try and come in on that bandwagon. And you need to be, have your eyes open of which is it? Is the infrastructure there? Is the first question. You know, in Ethiopia it is. In some other places it isn't. So what's the debt being used for? There's a new World Bank IMF publication called what's it called? The Changing Wealth of Nations. And that's a useful source because it's basically an inventory of assets. And you can then see what is the asset structure. With some societies, they've taken debts on but built assets that match. Others they haven't. Of course, the value of those assets entirely depends on whether the private sector comes in to use them. So never mind what the stuff cost, its value is not its cost. Its value is the forward-looking growth scenario, which is uncertain. But that's what where the infrastructure is there, you can think of a range of scenarios where the infrastructure gets used or where it doesn't. So that's the uncertainty, but it's useful to think in terms of scenarios here. Shell pioneered this idea of scenarios. With radical uncertainty, which we're all subject to, you can't know probabilities, but you can build scenarios, some of which are much more credible than others. And that's really the business you need to be in. Is there a credible scenario that that this country or this sector will sustain rapid growth. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
Oh, thank you very much. I'll now turn to a question from Michael Mlilo, who is having technical problems. So I'll ask his question for him. And after that, I'll turn to Robert Woodthorpe-Brown, who's got a couple of questions. So Michael Mlilo says he was curious about the exclusion of South Africa and Nigeria in your list of countries, and wonders whether that was a reflection of issues of governance in those countries. And then Robert, would you like to ask your questions?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Sir Paul. I started the African Insurance Organization in Mauritius in 1972, and it's just about to have its 50th anniversary. And I do think the African insurance market has a lot of funds that really could be better directed into investments, as my first question. The second one was that, can you comment on the Chinese investment strategy, the debt creation that results? That I think is quite important. And last, just a piece of information from what you said at the beginning. Addo was re-elected in Ivory Coast this weekend with 94% of the votes, a rather sort of totalitarian number. He is actually was also the guru that Macky Sall follows. So the pair of them are back in power.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Those are very good questions. So South Africa and Nigeria, obviously very different. South Africa is now pretty well led. Some good cabinet ministers and a good president. The challenge in South Africa is the appalling hangover from Zuma, which has infected deeply both the political organizations and a lot of the vital sinews of the state. And so there's a very arduous cleanup operation to do. And that is a struggle because the Zuma faction is weakened, but is pushing back. So you've got a very arduous struggle there, it's also this sort of legacy of grievance, which is fully justified sense of grievance, but is a distraction from a forward-looking common purpose, because grievance keeps driving the public narrative into a blame game, and blame games are sort of backward-looking and divisive, whereas for a society to succeed, it needs to build a forward-looking common purpose. I mean, that's what Lee Kuan Yew managed to do in Singapore. He turned the narrative around from a backward-looking blame game to a forward-looking common purpose. And on the back of that, a common strategy and so on, common obligations. And that's hard to do in South Africa because the grievances are so legitimate. But they make it hard to get this sort of forward-looking common purpose agenda. Nigeria, huge entrepreneurial energies, many of which are devastatingly misdirected, and there are pockets are good, and there are pockets are bad. I mean, the narrative got derailed in 1986, and for this I blamed the World Bank and IMF at the time. I was just training 300 IMF staff yesterday for the afternoon, and I did point this out to them. And this was the Structural Adjustment Program of 1986. which was a perfectly sensible program. There was nothing wrong with the details of the program, but the World Bank and the IMF owned the program as institutions, and they were the ones who went on television and said, this is the IMF World Bank program. And so it became identified not as this is what our government is doing, but as this is what the IMF and the World Bank are doing. And of course, the reason there was a program was the oil price had collapsed. And so imports more than halved, because there was a halving of the oil price and a switch from borrowing to repayment of debt, which was as big as the oil shock, a consequent of the oil shock. And so living standards collapsed unavoidably, inevitably. Thanks to the structural adjustment program, they collapsed a bit less than they would have done. But here was the IMF and the World Bank saying, this adjustment program is necessary and wonderful, and here were living standards collapsing. And so everybody blamed the adjustment program for the collapse in living standards. Unfortunately, the president who just left office when the adjustment program started was President Buhari. And guess what? He's president again. So like the rest of the Nigerian population, he learned all the wrong lessons. Because the policies for reform were associated with the living standard collapse. And it's very hard for people to be disabused of that. So it was a very dysfunctional, not social learning, but social mislearning. Societies depend upon rapid social learning. And unfortunately, neither Nigeria or North South Africa have really had it. Let me turn to Robert and the African insurance market, and I think you're completely right that there's really big funds available in Africa that are actually not directed into African investment. And what is missing in Africa is the sort of venture capital industry which is at smallish scale. I work with a venture capital firm in the north of England. I'm a Yorkshireman, and I'm very concerned that my part of the world has fallen behind London. 2/3 of the venture capital in Britain is allocated from London to the southeast and London itself. So the rest of England only gets about 1/3 of the venture capital. But this firm I'm dealing with, which is based in Leeds and has offices in a few regional centres, specialises in searching out small companies that look set for growth and then mentoring them and sticking with them for 8 or 10 years until they grow. That is the sector, the skill set, which is vital. I mean, this firm only takes about 1 in 50 of the firms that approach them, and they've learned which firms, they don't always get it right, but they get it right often enough, and they've learned how to mentor and transform these companies. That's the skill set that's not sufficiently present in Africa. You see it a bit in Nigeria, you see it a bit in Kenya, it's starting, but that's the skill set, the sector that needs to be linked up with the African pension and insurance pools. And we may go back to the point that I think Peter made about regulation, that the regulations need to be permissive of this sort of asset class. It's crazy that Africa is putting its insurance money into Deutsche bonds or whatever they're now called, but a sort of -2% real. That isn't safe that is surefire inability to meet your claims. And so a diversified portfolio where the risks are spread really lowers the risks a lot. And there's such promise in both helping and sharing in the benefits of rapid growth in Africa. Finally, your question about Chinese, what the Chinese have been up to. And, you know, it's been good and bad. They did go to African governments and say, what do you want? Which was a big advance over the preachiness of European governments, you know, trying to stuff our morals down reluctant throats. So that aspect of the Chinese approach was, I think, much better. It started from a dialogue of what do you want? You tell us what you want. Now, from that base, China has really missed a lot of opportunities. I talked with the Chinese government about this. For example, China has done urbanization, rapid urbanization, pretty successfully. Not perfectly, they made mistakes, but they didn't end up with vast megaslums. They really managed to build functional, productive cities. They've not transferred any of that know-how to Africa. It's an extraordinary omission. Why? Because what the Chinese were really interested in was winning contracts for whatever came into a president's head. You want a stadium, we'll build a stadium. You want an airport, we'll build an airport. And as collateral, getting hold of these countries' natural resources. And then getting them to say, oh, we have mutual benefit, we believe in mutual benefit, which of course meant we'll look after the benefit for China and you look after the benefit for your place. Just sign here. And of course, you've read the Chinese small print, which they haven't. And so those chickens are now starting to come home to roost. But fortunately, China is not in a very strong position because it will be a huge embarrassment to China if it starts doing to Africa what it did to Sri Lanka. It can beat Sri Lanka up because Sri Lanka doesn't have big allies, but it can't beat Africa up because the African Union will at some stage say that's not on. And so I think there's going to be huge pressure on China to get sensible rescheduling. And at the moment it's wriggling within the G20 of whether the debt relief applies to the debt that Chinese companies have incurred. It's saying, oh, there's a private sector. Well, you know, if you're silly enough to believe that, then I've got a bridge to sell you. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure on China, not least, I think, from the G7 to say, no, come off it. So China's got itself into an awkward position. It's got Africa into an awkward position, but it's going to rebound on China.
So, Paul, thank you so much. There, in fact, are more questions, but unfortunately, we haven't got time for them. This has been such an interesting talk and ranged over so many different areas of the same problem. And having you with your detailed knowledge there has been absolutely fascinating. And sort of ringing in my ears as we close is the need for common purpose, common strategy and common obligations. Wow. There we are. And I think I noticed a glint in your eye on that moral one, as you talked about flushing out the hit list of the world's big crooks.
Yes.
So, but thank you so much. And just finally, we'll have to see what we can do about that missing lunch sometime.